on the recording. But before we begin with tonight's class, I'd like to dedicate this class to the memory of Virginia's father. Please share his name with us. Who was, I personally did not have the merit of knowing him, but knowing you and your family, hello, welcome, come inside, grab a seat. Knowing you and your family is enough for me, and I believe all of us, to really value what a person he definitely was, to have raised such a beautiful family. And the legacy that he leaves with you is a blessing and beautiful continuity in this world. So thank you for sponsoring tonight's class. And the merit of the Torah learning that we are all involved in, and not just what we learned tonight, but every extra act of goodness, every bit of extra learning and positive action that results from what we learned tonight will be in his honor, his memory. As well, we want to wish a refuah shalema to your family members. Say their names. Should be our refuah shalema. And we should never need transplants such as that, but we should always be able to have such sacrifice to give of ourselves without having to give kidneys. So on that note, we are going to begin with the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers. And I would like to preface this by saying that, and you missed the introduction of what it is, but we will recap again, that there are many topics covered in each chapter of Pirkei Avos. Each chapter of Pirkei Avos covers a wide array of topics. We will not be going into each one of them. We will be focusing on specific ones and the ideas that we can take into our lives. But I strongly encourage you to continue your reading long past tonight's class. It will be a 6-week series because there are 6 chapters in Pirkei Avos, which each Shabbat, between Pesach and Shavuot, there are 6 Shabbats, and each Shabbat we actually read on Shabbat afternoon one chapter of Pirkei Avos. Some have the custom to continue as well all through the summer, but specifically between Pesach and Shavuot is the focus of what we're going to be learning. So on that note, I will tell you that the text can be found in the Siddur. If you have a Siddur in front of you and you want to read along, you're more than welcome to. If anybody wants to read, I think we will probably need to get a few more Siddurs. It's on page 271 if you'd like to follow along. And for those of you on Zoom, I will share my screen. This text is taken directly from Chabad.org, so you're welcome to read along on the screen. I'm just going to close the door so we don't hear the Arabic service in the background. We are a very busy happening synagogue, and we have the text over here. Those of you on Zoom, just give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to read from this over here, which is the Pirkei Avos. I am noticing that the cookies need some help over here. So if you haven't had one and you'd like one, please help yourself. So anybody want to read? Anybody who's comfortable reading Hebrew want to start with the first portion, Moshe? Anybody want to read? All right, let's move on to the English. Anybody want to read it in English? Okay, don't all answer at once. I wish my 10-year-old students in class who would be. All right, Linda, go unmute yourself and please begin reading. Moses.
Okay. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and gave it over to Joshua. Joshua gave it over to the elders of the prophets, and the prophets gave it over to the men of the great assembly. They, the men of the great assembly, would always say these 3 things: be cautious in judgment, establish many pupils, and make a safety fence around the Torah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for reading. That's perfect. We'll stop right there for now. And this is the beginning of Ethics of Our Fathers. The first idea that's brought down in the tractate in the Mishnah, which is discussing the people and the way of life behind the individuals who do all the do's and don'ts. As we said before, the Mishnah is mainly comprised of laws, the meaning for the laws, the reasoning for the laws, the back and forth conversation between the rabbis and how to obtain the verdict of which law we follow. That is the main idea of the Mishnah. But Pirkei Avot is the unique tractate of the Mishnah, which focuses more on our way of life, our ethics, our morals, the way we conduct ourselves as people in our daily interactions, rather than just the way that we uphold the law of the Torah. And we start off with the Mesorah. The Mesorah is the chain of the legacy, the chain of passing from one generation to another generation of the Torah, starting off by telling us that the Torah was given to Moshe. Moses received the Torah from Mount Sinai. So the first step was Moses. And then from Moshe Rabbeinu, it was passed down to Yehoshua, to Joshua. From Joshua, it was passed down to the Zekanim. The Zekanim are the elders of the Jewish people. From the elders, it was passed down to the Nevi'im, the prophets. And from the prophets, it was passed down to the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, which are the men of the Great Assembly. This seems like a very technical thing. Starting off by telling us, how did we get the Torah? It's like, whose hand was it passed down? Using the example of a kidney, right? So if anybody knows, in the medical institution, when an organ is being brought for transportation, there is a chain of custody that the organ always has to be in someone's hands. It always has to be tracked from the doctor, to the nurse, to the courier, always has to be passed down. So in the same vein, we're being told, how did the Torah get to us? It went from God to Moshe, from Moshe to Yehoshua, Yehoshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. Who cares? I mean, it's nice knowledge. But what does this teach us? What is the ethics, the morals, the values that we're supposed to learn from this? We're calling this the ethics of our fathers. There must be something that we can learn from this. So, interestingly, this chain of passing down from generation to generation is more than just a historical chain of events. It's more than just a timeline and a family tree. In fact, it is the step-by-step value system that we need to internalize in order for us to receive the Torah, which means in order for us to internalize the Torah that we learn, in order for the Torah to become part of our lives, we need to experience this chain as well. So we start off with Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu, the leader of the Jewish people, the one who took us out of Egypt, who gave us the tablets, who led us through the desert. Ultimately, his life ended when the Jews were at the cusp of entering Israel. He was the epitome of humility. The Torah tells us that Moshe was Anav Mikol Adam. He was the most humble person that existed, which is strange because he was also the person with the most powerful position in all of Jewish history. Yet he was the most humble person. He never attributed his greatness and his power and his strength to his own personal greatness and worth. He felt and lived with the thought and the feeling and the mindset that any good that he has is 100% from God. In fact, Moshe was called an Ish Elokim, which means he was a divine person. He was, do you want to put it into half man, half God? It wasn't that he was half man, half God. He was a man whose life was completely imbued with godliness. This humility of knowing that everything he had was from God, his strengths, his blessings were all from God, and every position that he was in was an opportunity to use in a way that God wanted him to. That is what enabled him to be the greatest leader of the Jewish people, and which is why every leader in every generation has a spark of the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu, because he personified this humility. So this first step for us to receive the Torah is to be humble. The only way that a person can truly learn something new is if they're willing to accept the fact that they don't know everything, that they have what to learn. Someone who believes that they know everything, they'll never ask questions, they'll never gain new information, even if they don't know anything, because they're not open to learning. The only way we can internalize godliness is if we are humble and we recognize that everything we have and everything we are is really from God. That opens up the vessel for wanting God and Torah into our lives. So Moshe kibel Torah. Moses received the Torah. Our inner Moses is our humility. That is what helps us receive the Torah. So that's the first step. Number one, we need to be humble. And it's important to know that humility does not mean self-deprecating. It doesn't mean saying, oh, I'm terrible, I'm worthless, I'm nothing, I'm really bad at this, I shouldn't do this because I'll never succeed. That's not humble, that's foolish. Or maybe insecure. Humility is knowing I have the talent and I will get it done because God gives me the strength. And I will accept help from other people when I need it because I'm not perfect, I'm godly. And godly creations are not perfect. Godly creations are open to growth. So that is how we receive the Torah in our lives. So that's step one. Moshe represents humility. I think we're starting to understand now that these are not just people. We're going to learn 5 basic values to help us appreciate Torah in our lives. So number 2, hello. So number 2, anyone remember who came after Moshe? Joshua. Who was Yehoshua? Yehoshua was Moshe's right-hand man. He was the student of Moshe Rabbeinu, who was his apprentice, so to speak. And he was actually the one who took over as the leader of the Jewish people after Moshe passed away. He was appointed as the leader of the Jewish people, and he was the one who led the Jewish people into Israel. So he, in essence, finished the job that Moshe started. Moses took us out of Egypt with this destination being Israel, and Yehoshua finished that task by leading the Jewish people into Israel and leading them through the battles of conquering the land of Israel and settling the land of Israel, leading the Jewish people in that time period of their settling in the land of Israel. And Yehoshua was known for his utmost dedication and his devotion. He was completely, in Yiddish, we use the word übergegeben, which means completely given over to his master. He recognized the importance and the beauty and the strength and the power of everything that Moshe was teaching him. And he was completely and wholeheartedly devoted to that. So from Yehoshua, we learn devotion, dedication. If we want to internalize Torah in our lives, we need to be dedicated to the Torah. Torah is something that can be learned, and it can also just fly over our heads. In order to internalize godliness, we need to be dedicated to it. We have to be devoted to it. When we learn Torah, we have to put ourselves into it wholeheartedly. And that's what allows us to allow the Torah to permeate our lives. So when we learn something, it's not just a nice piece of information. When we encounter a Jewish practice, it's not like, oh, that's nice. Okay, let me think about it, right? We want to be dedicated to it. We want to be wholeheartedly involved in that godly pursuit. That doesn't mean that we have to dedicate our entire lives 100% to perfect godliness to the exclusion of everything else. What it means is that whatever kernel of Torah, whatever kernel of religious practice it is, whatever it is that we are focusing on, doesn't have to be something major, but it has to be something that we dedicate ourselves to wholeheartedly. Whether it's one mitzvah, giving charity, lighting Shabbat candles, 5 minutes a day of Torah learning, whatever it is, we have to do it wholeheartedly, because that is when it becomes part of our lives and we receive the Torah in a way that we can actually appreciate in our own lives. So after we are humble, then comes the step of complete devotion, which brings us to the next link in the chain, which is the Zekanim, the elders. Who were the elders? Well, when the Jews left Egypt, there were a group of people who were considered the elders, and it was not because of their age. Yes, their status did come with age as well, but it was because of their diligence. These were people who were dedicated to the Jewish community. These were people who were dedicated to Torah learning, and they were diligent about it. They didn't just get old and become respected because they had long white beards or graying hair or walked with a cane. Yes, there is a mitzvah in the Torah to respect an elderly person because of their age, but they earned their title because of the way they diligently learned Torah all the years of their lives. And they focused on it for a significant amount of time, which is why they were called the elders, because they reached that status with a significant amount of time of dedication and learning and growth. And the elders teach us that in order to really receive the Torah in our lives, we have to stick at it. It doesn't come in one day. It's not just enough to throw ourselves into it wholeheartedly. That's important. But we have to be willing to take it long term and find a way to make it sustainable so that we can diligently keep this element of the Torah, whatever it is that we're trying to absorb in our lives, over a long period of time, in a way that we become old with this concept. We become an elder in this Torah knowledge. If it's giving the previous example, it's the mitzvah of charity. It's not just giving a one lump sum to charity and saying, wow, I give this bit of charity to a wonderful organization that I support with my whole heart, and I'm, to use the word, the halachic term, I'm yotze. I, fulfilled my obligation. No, it's better to give a little bit every day, wholeheartedly, but also over a long period of time. Then it's something that becomes a habit. It becomes part of our life. And that's when it becomes really permeated in every part of our day. So this third stage, the elders teach us the idea of maintaining our dedication and our wholehearted passion on a consistent basis, on a way that is sustainable, it is long-term, and it becomes real to us, that it's part of our lives. And then we get to step 4, the prophets. Who are the prophets? What makes somebody a prophet? If you had to describe a prophet, what would you say? Feel free to unmute yourself, lady. What would you say? What is a prophet? Okay, someone with divine intelligence. You're good. You should sit in the seat next time. Divine intelligence. Anybody want to add anything? What makes somebody a prophet? Let me ask.
All of their positive, like an algorithm to it, like all of their fortune telling, visions.
Okay, so you think they make up visions, and if they're true long enough? Okay. Erica, what do you say?
Someone with like a divine connection to God, who can like speak on behalf. But I don't know if vision would be the right term, but I guess that's a way to put it. But they have
Okay.
like their divine connection that they could speak on behalf to say this is what should be done.
So let me ask you a different question. Can anybody choose to become a prophet?
No.
So I've read some books recently, actually, that
Mhm.
people to maybe attain their
That's true. But is it something that people can choose? The answer to that is no,
Really?
because prophecy is not fortune telling. Prophecy, a prophet in Judaism, is someone who receives a prophecy from God. So everything we're saying is true. It's someone who is able to communicate a divine message, has divine intelligence. The difference is that it's not something that a person creates on their own. God gifted certain individuals with prophecy. God gave them the divine message and they were able to relay it. In the time of our prophets, there were certain individuals, and that doesn't mean that God randomly appears to anybody and that's a prophecy. There were certain people who attained such a level of spirituality that they were the right vessel for God to choose them to give prophecy to. So our patriarchs and our matriarchs received prophecy in the times of over here, in the times of after Moshe Rabbeinu, and in the times of the prophets, the book of the prophets, there were many prophets. These were individuals who were given divine messages. If a person decides that they have received prophecy, then that's really hallucination. Now, there's a big difference between someone feeling a divine connection and receiving a sign that they feel is a message from God in their life, and a prophecy, because a prophecy is a message that God gives an individual in order for them to relay it to others. But the idea of prophecy is that it's something that God bestows upon a person. Now, if we cannot choose to be prophets, and none of us here are, well, I don't know about anybody else, a spiritual level, I'm not a prophet. What does that have to do with each one of us? How can we attain this level? So far, we've been discussing that each of these individuals in the chain of events and the chain of custody of the Torah and passing it down to us are all levels that we should aspire to attain. What is the idea of us achieving the level of prophecy? So the idea is that the Nevi'im, the prophets, teach us that no matter how smart we are, no matter how brilliant and how learned and how knowledgeable we are, there is a certain amount of help that we need from God in order to be God-fearing, which means that our experience as people who are connected to Torah cannot be one-sided. We need God's help because in essence, it's a relationship. No matter how close you want to be to someone and how much you want to learn about that person and understand the way they feel and really appreciate everything they do and communicate with them, the only way to have a true relationship with a person is if they reciprocate. Otherwise, you're kind of stalking them, right? If they don't reciprocate. So what is the way we have a relationship with God through the Torah? Is that we give it our all with the humility, with the devotion, with the diligence and the consistency. But we also pray to God that He gives us His part, that Hashem grants us the ability to have a relationship with Him. And that is through prayer, through connecting with God in a way that we speak to God and ask God for help. That is how we achieve the level of prophecy. Not that we become prophets, but we learn from the prophets, because a true prophet is one who recognized that their knowledge was only coming from God and not from themselves. It was because God had opened up this channel of prophecy for them to relay the messages to the rest of the Jewish people. And we can open up that channel for ourselves by praying to God to bestow His divinity upon us, that we should feel the spark of spirituality. And we have been blessed that we are able to feel the spark of spirituality. We are able to feel that inspiration, that excitement to do something. The Tanya, the Hasidic teachings use the word isarusa de le'ela and isarusa de l'sata. These are very deep Hasidic terms, but the idea is that it is an awakening from below, an awakening within yourself, that you are motivated to do the right thing. And then there's an awakening from above. All of a sudden you're like struck by this divine mood. You ever have it? Like all of a sudden, usually it happens like at 2 a.m, you're like struck with this excitement to do something and it just comes out of nowhere. So sometimes it's, I don't know, for a business project. And sometimes it's like you're inspired to start a project, you're inspired to sponsor something, you're inspired to, learn something new. And that inspiration, that spark of enlightening feeling, where does that come from? You didn't cause it, you didn't work for it, it just came. That is an inspirational spark that comes from God, that God has given you a gift. What do you do with that gift? Well, that's up to you. If you take it and run with it, then you form a strong relationship with God. If you ignore it and you wait for that to pass, well, then it's like when I get struck with the desire to wash dishes, I sit on the couch until I don't feel like doing it anymore, and it's all good. But when it's a spiritual desire, we should grab it, because that is God giving us that kernel of prophecy, that feeling of excitement to do it. That is what we pray for. When we feel like we want Torah in our lives, but we are having a hard time finding the motivation within ourselves, or finding the dedication or devotion or the ability to make it sustainable and consistent, that's when we pray to God to give us that spark of prophecy, to give us that boost of encouragement that we need. And that helps us make Torah part of our lives as well. Which brings us now to the 5th level. Remind me, ladies, who's the 5th one in the chain? The men of the great assembly. It sounds like a very fancy club, right? The men of the great assembly. In Hebrew, they are called the Anshe Knesset Hagadola. Anshe Knesset Hagadola was a group of great sages, Talmudic scholars, Torah giants. Many of the members of this group are actually quoted throughout Pirkei Avot for their insights and teachings. And the purpose of this group of people was specifically to decide the halacha in the way that it would be practically kept for the entire Jewish community at large. So, from when the Jews left Egypt, everybody was together. All the Jews were together. So they would learn from their teachers, and it would just get passed down. The tradition, the customs, the laws, the way of Jewish life as it is practically lived day to day was passed down from teacher to student, and then it was taught, but everyone was together. So nothing got misinterpreted or explained incorrectly. But as time passed and the Jewish people entered Israel, there was, again, this very specific way of teaching, and education was upheld in this exact manner. The time was passing and the Jews were being dispersed. And there weren't competent Torah teachers in every single Jewish community. And there was a serious concern that the proper manner of keeping tradition would be lost. And so the Anshe Knesset Hagdola were tasked with the job of putting the Jewish customs, practices, and halacha as we know it today into protocols that everyone can follow, is written down. For example, one of the examples that is given, the Anshe Knesset Hagdola were the first ones who wrote the prayers as they are in the Siddur. Until then, everybody just knew the prayers because everybody was in the same synagogues. They all just learned the prayers. But what would happen if somebody moved away? How would they remember the prayers? How would they teach it correctly to their children? It would have been lost. At some point, the chain would be broken. So they wrote down the Siddur. They wrote down the practical things like the blessings that we say on the food, the Kiddush, Havdalah, the way that it should be said properly and kept properly so that it should be upheld even in places where there wasn't perfect Torah institutions. So the Anshe Knesset Hagadola was focused on practical day to day. And that is the final link in this chain that we discussed. How can we make Torah part of our lives if we bring spirituality into the practical parts of our day? Not just into the holy parts of our day, but into the food that we eat, adding a blessing, the prayers that we say, saying them properly, the regular things. We're going to sleep, we say the Shema. Sleeping is something everybody does. Every animal needs to sleep. Every person needs to sleep. It's not a holy thing. Sleeping is not a holy thing. But when we say the Shema prayer, we're transforming this practical thing that we need to do into something that is now spiritual. Food, everybody needs food. Even plants need food. Food is just a basic part of life. But the blessings on the food, well, that makes it practical. And that makes the practical spiritual. So we see from this basic idea, which tells us, by the way, just how profound everything in Pirkei Avos really is. Because just from the basic teachings of the Torah was passed from Moses to Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great assembly, we can look at this and we can say, okay, thanks for that information. Good to know how the Torah got to us. But if we look at it in this deeper manner, it becomes a roadmap for how we can bring Torah into our lives. It is now the blueprint of how we can make Torah accessible to us. Number one, Moses teaches us humility. Number two, Joshua teaches us dedication. Number three, the elders teach us diligence and consistency. Number four, the prophets teach us bringing God into our lives to awaken the spark of spirituality. And number five, the men of the great assembly, the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, teach us the importance of practical application, bringing God into our lives. So now that we have this, let's get back to our text. What did they say? The Anshe Knesset Hagadola said the following three things. Number one, Hevu Mesunim Badin, be patient in judgment. Number two, V'he'emidu Talmidim Harbe, establish many students. And number three, Va'asu Siag LaTorah, and make a protective fence for the Torah, which means establish rules for yourself to keep you from doing things that are against the Torah. Make a fence. That's what they said. Each of these three things are wonderful life lessons. Number one, be patient in judgment. Don't rush to judge people. In general, you shouldn't judge people. When you're encountering a person, be patient. Be willing to hear them out before you pass a decision on a person. Be patient. Don't rush into judgment. Number two, establish many students. This is an interesting one because not everyone is in the position of having students. But the idea here is, if you want your Torah to be meaningful, you need it to teach it to others. You don't have to be a formal teacher in order to have students. What it means is, share the knowledge and the beauty that you have in your life with other people. In fact, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was known to tell people, if you know Aleph, teach Aleph. If you know Bet, teach Bet. Aleph and Bet are the first two letters of the Hebrew language. You would think, before you start teaching the Hebrew letters of the alphabet, you should know them all. At least know from Aleph till Taf, and then you'll start teaching. Don't become a Hebrew teacher before you even know all the Hebrew alphabet. The Rebbe said, no. You don't have to know everything in order to inspire somebody else. If you know Aleph, you can teach Aleph. You know Bet, you'll teach Bet. Learning and teaching are intertwined. In fact, in the Hebrew language, the word to learn is, the root word is lamed mem daled, and the word to teach is lamed mem daled. Lilmod and lilamed. The letters, the word is exactly the same, only the vowels are slightly different, because to learn comes through teaching. So the more you teach other people, the more you're learning for yourself. I know for myself that when I need to teach a class, and I teach many classes, I'm constantly learning. And the stuff that I retain most and I truly understand is the stuff that I teach. When I learn on my own, and I try to because, Torah learning is important and I enjoy reading and learning new things. When I'm just reading or learning for myself, I really do not absorb it half as much as when I'm learning in order to teach, because there's this idea that I need to really understand it fully in order to explain it to somebody else. So that's the way we should live our lives. We should incorporate Torah values in our lives so that it's so real to us that we want to share it with others. Establish many students. Share everything that you have with others. And the more you share, the more you want to share. So automatically, the more you learn. And the last one is, Torah. Make a fence for the Torah. Look at restrictions, the don'ts in Judaism, not as limitations, but as a protection. You can look at a fence and you can say, ugh, I can't pass it, right? Driving and there's the barricade and it's really annoying because the street is blocked off. I wish I could just go through that barricade. It's a burden that we have this barricade over there. Look at it from the other perspective. It's a protection because the other side of that is a ditch. So if you're going to drive through this barrier and say, I don't want to be restricted by this boundary, you're going to be in danger. There's a construction zone over there. You keep driving past the barricade, you'll be in serious danger. So the same barricade could be looked at as a restrictive, oppressive thing that's stopping you from going forward. Or you could look at it as a protection that is keeping you safe from the danger that is beyond it. An example I was once given, I love it. I always think about it when I'm with my children about playground. Imagine a playground, and I'm sure I've shared this before, but it's always worth repeating again. Imagine a playground that's right off a highway. And the children want to play in this playground. Imagine there was no fence and you were the teacher on recess duty in that playground. Would you let the kids run around? No, you would not let the kids run around. The kids would not be free in that place because the danger is over here. But because there's no fence, you wouldn't even let them play over here because maybe they'll get too far. So all of a sudden, there's no freedom in this playground because there's a highway right there. Now imagine there's a playground off a highway, but there's a really secure fence. Now you can let them play wherever they want because they have this boundary that's keeping them safe, that you know that they won't be in danger of becoming injured or being hit, God forbid, or anything like that. So the fence, the barricade, actually gives them freedom because they can express themselves within the space that is permissible to them to the fullest. Torah provides us with many restrictions, things that we are not allowed to do as religious practicing Jews. And the more our lives are involved in Jewish practice, the more don'ts we can encounter. And we can look at them as oppressive. It's so hard. I can't dress in this way. I cannot use my phone on Shabbat. I cannot, as a woman, sing in front of men. Whatever it is that feels like a restriction that makes life difficult. It's true. You could look at it like that. And if you choose to look at restrictive, oppressive feelings when you see the don'ts of Jewish law, Judaism is pretty miserable. It's true. Just like if I look at driving and I say, oh, the red lights are terrible. I always have to stop and I always have to yield to other cars and I have to put my blinkers on if I want to change lanes. It's so hard. Why can't I just drive, do whatever I want? Nobody would think that. Maybe in the middle of the night, you might think that when there's no cars on the road. But normally, thank goodness there are red lights. Otherwise, you know how many accidents it would be? Thank goodness there are stop signs or people would never be able to cross the street. The restrictions are protections. And the same is in Judaism. The do's and don'ts within Jewish practice allow our souls to live in a way that expresses ourselves in our best way. God's the one who created us. He knows what's best for us. And God created this set of do's and don'ts. So the Pirkei Avos is teaching us here that we should look at the rules of the Torah as protection. And we should embrace Jewish life with a mindset that everything that God tells us to do and not to do is there to safeguard our souls and to keep us living our best life possible. And then we can look at everything in our life from a positive way. Because if it's a protection, then we appreciate it. If it's a restriction, then we resent it. So we should look at the rules in our lives as a protection. So this is yet another idea of things that we can learn, not just what to do, but how to approach the things that we do and how to feel towards the things that we do. So we have a little time. I'm going to share my screen again. Who would like to read part 2? We're going to end with this. It is a beautiful thought. And it is explained by Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was one of the last members of the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, the men of the Great Assembly. Who would like to read part 2? Anybody? All right, Yvette, read. Go. We have somebody here reading, so read loud so everybody can hear you. Beautiful. So this is what he used to say. The Torah stands on 3 things. There are 3 pillars that the world stands on. Torah, the study of Torah. Avoda, which is service of God, which translates into prayer. And Gimilut Chasadim, acts of kindness. That is what makes the world stand. And the visual of this is very important and very powerful. Let me turn the air up a bit. Cool. Oh, you just say something. It was so hot when I came in, so I made it very low. The world stands on 3 things: Torah, Avoda, Gemilut Chasadim. But it doesn't stand on these 3 things as one on top of the other. They stand as pillars, like a 3-legged stool. Imagine, I would have brought a ball to show you, but I don't have one here. So imagine you have the ball, right? And there are 3 pillars. 3 pillars that are standing, and you place the ball on top. What happens if you lose one? It falls. Each one is equally important because the world cannot stand on just 2 legs. Imagine a table with 3 legs. It's very sturdy. But you lose one leg and it topples over. It's not that the world stands on level 1 is Torah. First and foremost, learn Torah. Then pray, and then be kind. Or even the opposite. First be kind, then pray, then learn Torah. No. These are 3 legs that the world stands on. We need all 3 simultaneously. There are many people who spend their days doing acts of kindness. And that's wonderful, that's beautiful, that's very important. But that is not enough to live a Torah life. That is not enough to keep the world standing. We also need prayer, and we also need Torah. Now, that means in our own personal world, in the microcosm of what we're discussing here, in our own personal world, we need all 3. And on a macro level, the world needs all 3. Sometimes we are the leg of Torah study. Everyone has their focus. Some people are more focused on Torah study. Some people are more focused on kindness. Some people are more focused on prayer. And we need to recognize that each one is extremely important. So if it's not our focus, then we should appreciate that somebody else is focusing on it, because collectively we are making the world stand. which lends itself to another idea that I think is really important and really valuable, especially in this time period. Each one of us has our own mission. Now, the fact that we are passionate in one area of spirituality or even in one area of life doesn't make us, doesn't give us a pass to exclude from any other area. You couldn't tell someone, because you're so brilliant, you're so smart, you're exempt from being kind. No, everybody needs to have all of them. But some people, their focus is on charitable acts and they're constantly giving and they have run organizations that support other people. And maybe they don't have as much time to learn Torah. And there are people who, of course, still have to include each one in their own lives, but they are focused on prayer. They spend many, many, many hours a day praying. They teach prayer, they run synagogues, whatever it is. And they don't have as much time to run around and assist people who are in need. And there are people who spend their time learning Torah, teaching Torah. They spend their days in yeshiva, wherever they are. And they don't have so much time for everything else. Many people look at their own lives and they think of their own passion and they say, well, my way is good. Look what I'm focused on. Why don't you do enough of that also? Someone who's very into charity is going to look at somebody else who doesn't involve themselves as much in charity and be like, you should really do more charity. And that can lend itself to recognizing and focusing on other people's differences. And focusing on, they're not as good as me because they do less of this important thing that I do more of. And over here we see that the world equally stands on three completely different pillars, which reminds us that our differences are important because the world needs all of us and our different missions in order to stand and thrive and grow and be a place that we can all feel comfortable in, which is an important point to remember, especially nowadays, because we are in the time of the Sfirat HaOmer. And the time period of the Omer was actually a very, very sad time in Jewish history, because Rabbi Akiva, who was the great sage who was a descendant of converts, he was illiterate, could not read Hebrew or learn any Torah until the age of 40, when he went to yeshiva for the first time. At the age of 40, he started learning the alphabet with the little boys in the yeshiva, and he turned his entire life around, and he became the greatest Torah scholar on par with Moses, if one can even say. And he taught, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," we should love our neighbors, our fellows, the way we love ourselves. And his students were imbued with this concept, but they had a really big issue. They couldn't respect each other's differences. They thought, if I love you so much, then I need to make you agree with me because I'm for sure right. And I love you so much that I'm going to fight with you until you believe that my way is correct. And there was a terrible plague that befell his students, and 24,000 of his students perished during the time between Pesach and Shavuot. In fact, Lag BaOmer, we celebrate as Day of Great Celebration. One of the reasons is because the students stopped dying on that day. And this is why this time period is the time period of mourning. And there are certain laws and customs during this time. We do not listen to music. A cappella becomes our best friend. I have great a cappella playlist on Spotify because we don't listen to music during this time period. We don't get haircuts. We don't have weddings. We don't buy and wear new clothing. And we refrain from saying the blessing of Shehechianu. So if we don't eat a new fruit, that would require us to say Shehechianu, because those are all celebratory experiences which one does not do during a period of mourning. And the entire Jewish nation is collectively mourning the fact that a group of great Torah scholars were not able to appreciate and respect each other for their differences. So the fact that the Torah sits and exists because of these three pillars teaches us that we need to incorporate these three pillars into our lives: Torah study, prayer, and acts of good deeds. But it also reminds us that the world exists on three completely different pillars. So if somebody is more focused on maintaining and upholding the world from a different pillar, we shouldn't look at them and say, not as good. We should look at them and say, thank you for holding up your side of the world. We should respect each other's differences, embrace each other for our differences, because that truly is what God wants of us. There is no greater joy for a parent than to see their children getting along. That's what brings a parent most joy, to see the family united. And that's what God wants. God wants to see us, his children, united. And he wants us to be united through these three pillars: Torah, avoda, prayer, and acts of kindness. So on that note, we have covered these two first Mishnahs of the first chapter of Pirkei Avot. I will tell you that there are nuggets of diamonds in the rest of the chapter. So I'm going to challenge anybody and everybody. Read up on the rest of the chapter. Don't read chapter 2. We're going to have nothing to teach you next week. Read up on anything else in the chapter. And I'd love if anybody wants to share next week. We're going to start the class. Anybody who wants to share any other idea that they learned from the rest of this chapter, we'll be able to go through that as well. And if anybody wants to share how they incorporated any of these ideas into their lives, that will be a beautiful way to start off next week's class. So on that note, I will wish everybody l'chaim, to upholding the world and our end of the pillar, and reminding ourselves to focus and absorb the Torah through, number 1, humility, number 2, devotion, number 3, consistency, number 4, remind me, what was number 4? We said devotion already.
Diligence, practicality.
We missed one before practicality. Number 4, asking God for help to give us divine inspiration. And number 5, practicality. And then once we have all those things, we can remember that the Torah is here to protect us. So we can be grateful for the restrictions and the protective boundaries. Establish a lot of students. If you know something, teach something. And judge slowly. Be patient in your judgment. Accept other people. Those are the lessons from tonight's Pirkei Avot. We have reached the heart of the ethics of our fathers. And on that note, good night, everybody. If you have any questions, please unmute yourself.